Astrological Analysis of Jeffrey Dahmer by Ciro Discepolo. Some astrological reflections on Jeffrey Dahmer, the so-called cannibal monster who killed 17 young men, including boys, and ate some of them. Dahmer was arrested, remember, on July 22nd of 1991 and confessed to all the crimes he had committed. He also added some murders that didn't seem to be crimes, such as those involving missing persons, and was sentenced to 17 life sentences for a total of 957 years. But a few years later, on November 28, 1994, he was brutally murdered by another lifer suffering from schizophrenia. So let's observe the birth chart of Jeffrey Dahmer, who, remember, was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21st, 1960 at 4:34 p.m. And these are extremely precise birth data as they come from the registry office. This birth chart can also help us better understand the birth charts of many murderers in contemporary crime history. Personally, I'm convinced that astrology should have a priority role within the team of experts called upon to comment on the mysteries that unfortunately plague our society these days in Italy, the rest of Europe, and the rest of the world. This is particularly true for sexually motivated murders, or let's say feminicides, or as in this case serial killers, who, motivated primarily by sexual and criminal urges, committed and continue to commit many crimes today. In this specific case, as I mentioned, Dahmer killed 17 young men. He then had sex with them even after their deaths. He ate some of them, chopped them up, stripped them of their flesh, turned them into ornaments, and kept many of their body parts, documents, and even photographs taken at various stages of the processing process. This means that after killing them, Dahmer performed a macabre ritual that included sex, which was undoubtedly the primary stimulus. But there was also this very terrifying aspect of the dismemberment of the bodies, which Dahmer carried out by cutting the corpses into pieces, removing the head from the torso, crushing the bones, and so on. Now, as I was saying, this natal chart is very interesting also because it allows us to establish different reading perspectives, which must be different, necessarily different. It would be hypocritical of me to say that one astrological reading is as good as another astrological reading. No, absolutely not. I am convinced that judicial astrology, first and foremost, should have absolute priority over all other astrologies that define themselves as esoteric, psychological, evolutionary, quantum, spiritual, and so on. And then, of course, I particularly emphasize my school of active astrology, which derives directly from judicial astrology, since the dividing line between it and all the others is precisely that judicial astrology is distinguished by its judgments. Therefore, even referring to the etymology of the word in the English language, judgment indicates a blunt, precise reading, and does not rely on adjectives that could be proposed in abundance to explain everything, and even the opposite of everything. No, precisely. Anyone who has studied my books knows that this doesn't exist, and that I personally favor the reading method in which, if a person is blind, we call them blind and don't beat around the bush, paying attention to the politically correct attitude that tells us we shouldn't call them blind, but handicapped. But then they tell us that handicapped isn't okay either, so we should say disabled. But then they tell us that disabled isn't okay either, so we should say differently abled. Until the day they tell us we should express ourselves by saying that the person is better than us. And fine, we can also say they're better than us. But they're still blind, though. So, back to us. My school derives from forensic astrology and has as its starting point, above all my teacher, Andrei Barbolo, who first and foremost based the reading of the natal chart on the dominants, with which I completely agree. And in the dominants, Andrei Barbeau strongly emphasized the weight and direction of reading based on the statistical studies of the Gauquelin couple, Michel and Françoise Gauquelin, who demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt the power of the stars at the four corners of the sky at rising, culmination, setting, and midnight. This is certainly a very important first reading. However, let's also remember that in the dominant reading proposed by the great André Barbault, there was also a strong intertwining of the other values of the natal chart. Therefore, importance was given to the sign occupied by the sun, the ascendant sign, the lunar sign, and also the main aspects that the various stars formed in the natal chart. And the additional contribution I think I've made in reading the dominant is that I've given enormous space, enormous importance to the so-called intercepted sign. That is what I've called the intercepted sign, and which corresponds to the sign in relation to the house occupied by the sun. In other words, I've always written in my books, and I reiterate it today, that the most important sign concerning us is not the sun sign, nor the ascendant, nor even the moon sign, but the sign that corresponds to the house at the time of our birth. So if we're born in the dead of night, say 3 a.m., the sun will certainly be in the second house, which is equivalent to the second sign of the zodiac, Taurus. So we'll be very much Taurus even if we're born in the month of Sagittarius or Capricorn or Aquarius or Pisces or whatever. For this reason, in my opinion, the intercepted sign is much stronger than the others. Again, according to my studies, the intercepted sign must be read as itself and as its opposite, because each sign contains a set of symbols that are specific to that sign, but also specific to the sign I've called compensated. To be clear, we usually say, or have read for millennia, that Libra is sweet, sociable, balanced, kind and moderate, but almost nothing could be further from the truth. Because in most cases, Libra is a flame, a fiery person, even a fanatic, if you will, who snaps at alleged elements of treason and acts like a person blinded by hatred, then unleashes that hatred in every direction. Therefore, these two passages, in my opinion, are fundamental, especially in interpreting people involved in crimes like Jeffrey Dahmer. In fact, Dahmer apparently has nothing of the criminal about him if we were to limit ourselves to a scholastic reading of the astrology surrounding him. Because Dahmer was a Gemini with Libra rising and the moon in Aries, let's just say there was apparently nothing to suggest the monster he undoubtedly was, with or without quotation marks. Why? Because first of all, if we continue to see him as a Gemini with Libra rising, we understand nothing of this natal chart. But if we begin to see him as someone strongly governed by Pluto and Scorpio, then the perspective changes completely compared to the initial vision. I'd like to recall, especially for Italian readers, two cases that can somehow bring us closer to this type of reading. I'm talking about Pietro Pacciani, the so-called alleged monster of Florence, who wasn't the monster of Florence at all, as I tried to explain in a book entirely dedicated to that topic. Pacciani was a monster in many ways because he was violent, because he was a beast in the Dantean sense. He was also a wicked man who had begun raping his little girls from a very young age, and had continued this violence for over 20 years, even raping them together, using plastic dildos and the like. And also, Pacciani apparently had nothing to do with a potential criminal or someone who would be the protagonist of a crime story, because Pacciani was a Capricorn. But in fact, Pacciani was much more Scorpio than Capricorn, having the sun in the 8th house. And even now, in the current events of the Gallasco crime, we find that Alberto Stasi, a man definitively convicted under Italian law, also apparently has nothing to do with crime stories, being a Cancerian. Perhaps many people stop at this initial astrological attribution. After all, a sensitive, introverted boy, needy of his mother, and they read this about Cancer, but fail to mention that Alberto Stasi has both the sun and a stellium in the 8th house, meaning he is strongly Scorpio and Pluto, as evidenced by the rest of his natal chart. So even in this case, we shouldn't be talking about a Gemini with Libra rising, but a young man with very strong Pluto and Scorpio values. In fact, the sun in the 8th tells us that the most important sign concerning him was Scorpio. The stellium of the sun, Mercury and Venus, in the 8th house tells us that the most important sign we should refer to is Scorpio. Half of the first house is in the sign of Scorpio because the ascendant is in Libra, but takes up a good part of the sign of Scorpio, and above all, Pluto is more important than ever. Unfortunately, in this astrological set, because it is located in the 11th house, which I would like to point out from my research and my discoveries, turns out to be much more mournful than the 8th. And then it rules the sign intercepted by both the presence of the sun and the presence of a stellium in the 8th house. And then it's square to the sun at the time of Dahmer's birth and forms a horrible sesquisquare with Saturn, a semi-square with the ascendant, and a sesquisquare with the moon. It's truly frightening. Also a square with Mercury. So this Pluto has enormous relevance in this natal chart, and Jeffrey Dahmer's mental orientation was precisely that of a very close union between Eros and death, which are the fundamental themes of both Pluto and the sign of Scorpio and the 8th house. So it's true that as a child he was badly guided by his father, who, however, with good intentions, tried to focus his son's libido on something constructive. He taught him, for example, to perform small autopsies on the carcasses of dead animals they found in the countryside, in the woods. They would bring them home, and his father would teach him how to perform these autopsies, because in good faith she hoped that the child, who had appeared somewhat problematic from birth, would pursue scientific studies. And in a certain sense, this was also her initial direction. But then the other values in her birth chart strongly conflicted, or we might say supported, these negative values, producing what has been one of the ugliest crime stories of all time. In fact, let's say that a significant influence on the Dahmer affair was the totally isolated Neptune in her natal chart. Don't be fooled by an aspect to the lunar node, because the lunar node, as you'll know if you've studied my books, is just a rumor. It has no validity whatsoever. So this Neptune, totally isolated and in the sign of Scorpio in the 1st house, determined a mix of mental orientations halfway between sex and alcohol. Dahmer began to drink excessively and was practically drunk almost constantly from morning till night. But this was already at 16, when he was already aware of the fact that he was gay and therefore faced more difficulties than other kids, because he was trying to hide this fact from his parents. And then because in the America of the 1970s and 1980s, in a Wisconsin city like Milwaukee, certainly not a futuristic city like New York, Los Angeles, or San Francisco at the time, but a city deeply rooted in religion. It was undoubtedly difficult for a gay boy to find compatible spaces. We're not entirely sure that his first murder happened almost by chance, almost by accident, but in fact there were 17 murders that testify to his precise desire to experience this kind of pleasure, because that's what it was. He even stated in an interview with a major television network shortly before his death that his goal was not murder. Murder was merely a means by which he achieved moments of great erotic and sexual pleasure through sexual intercourse with the corpses of his young victims, even eating them. Then, many days later, he masturbated, touching their innards, and so on. We can also note that young Dahmer's sexuality was aggressive and violent, undoubtedly because of a very close semi-square between his natal Mars in Aries and Venus in Taurus. The square of Uranus to Venus speaks to his homosexuality, which, however, can remain latent in many people throughout their lives and never manifest itself. Let's also say that these are lifestyles that are also greatly influenced by the place and time in which they emerge. And from this point of view, Dahmer, in my opinion, was unlucky, because if he had been born, say, in the 1980s in California, specifically in San Francisco, he probably would have had a very rich gay sex life, and perhaps would not have been drawn toward those crimes. However, mind you, I am absolutely not justifying his birth chart, because I am convinced that he could have easily controlled or built his future on positive values. Therefore, I do not justify in the slightest what he did with his birth chart. One more consideration on timing. Obviously, this birth chart lends itself perfectly to reflecting the theory I have explained in dozens and dozens of books. I would like to point out that I have published over 150 books in 8 languages, as well as thousands of YouTube videos and essays, mostly published on Google Books. So, as I was saying, the timing of the various phases of the life of this man, who died young, as those who have studied my texts will know, is offered to us by the intertwining of 3 different scopia, that of the natal chart, including the transits that pass through it, and above all by the very close interplay between this natal chart, the solar return, and the lunar return of every single important event in his life. I won't go any further here. I'll just focus on the arrest stars, which, as you can see from the 2 graphs I'm showing you, tell us about the solar return of May 22nd, 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which preceded his arrest, which, I repeat, occurred on July 22nd, 1991. And what do we find in that solar return? We find 2 elements in particular. I won't list them all here, but 2 elements are fundamental. The sun in the first house, whose full significance even today scholars who claim to be my students have not yet fully grasped. They pretend not to understand that a sun in the first house is like a sun in the 12th house, or an ascendant in the 12th house, or a Mars in the 1st, 6th, or 12th house. And then a Saturn in the 10th often tells us that the subject is rubbing his life in his own hands. This is the solar return. The lunar return, if you like, is even more explicit. Erected on July 5th, 1991, again in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and including the date of the arrest, July 26th, 1991. It shows us an ascendant in the 11th house, which, again, according to my studies, is even stronger than the 7th in relation to the subject of law. And then it shows us a Mars in the 12th house. The 12th house understood as the mother of all misfortunes. So finding Mars in the 12th house equates to the worst that can happen to us in life. And this Mars, let's note, is also the 11th cusp, the law again. And then, to be as didactic as possible, we find the rather close conjunction of Neptune and Uranus in the 4th house, indicating an abrupt and horrific change of domicile from one hour to the next, when Dahmer was arrested and sent to prison, from which he would never be released. And the icing on the cake, Saturn in the 5th house, which signifies an almost total reduction in all playful and recreational activities, which, in his case we know well, were closely linked to sex, violent sex and murderous sex.